This stemmed from research that I was originally doing looking into the EU-Caribbean preferential agreement on bananas, and as well as the rise of Alba and Petrocaribe, or Petrocaribe, one of the two. It shifted a bit as I was doing the research because of all the new talk now around the rise of the South. And of course, the rise of the South includes all these larger southern countries experiencing substantial economic growth, gradual improvement in their social indicators. I think most people in this room are familiar with this argument, especially the BRIC countries. A relatively recent UNDP report notes that the share of South-South trade of world merchandise trade increased from 8% in 1980 to 26% by 2011. Now, the interesting thing, of course, and it's been noted in this workshop already, is that not all of the southern countries of the world, of course, have been magnets for all this new investment and this new trade. They have experienced rapid economic growth, nor have they experienced substantial increases to their political and their diplomatic weight in the international arena. So it's a highly varied rise of the South. So I became interested when I was looking at the Caribbean, is looking at the impact of the rise of the South on these smaller states, and with particular focus for this paper on the South-South cooperation that's emerged. So the first part of my paper, critiques free trade as I already did yesterday, and with more of a focus on the notion of reciprocity, which they use in international trade. Everybody's reciprocally lowering their trade relations. So I won't get into that other than to point out that the central thrust of what I argue about that is that international trade and trade agreements, which is what's being argued by others in this panel, must be understood as being inseparable from politics and economics of statecraft. Otherwise, you're not discussing real-world trade if you're talking about trade with these things left out. So in terms of my specific example, I look at new forms of South-South cooperation in the Caribbean. I looked a little bit at China as well, but this paper focuses on ALBA. ALBA is a project that, of course, gradually more members have been signing up to over the last few years. It was formed in 2004. It now has 8 full members, including 3 of which are Eastern Caribbean states. Petrocaribe was formed in 2005, and of course it's spearheaded by Venezuela, which sells oil under preferential credit and offers low-interest loans to 18 Caribbean states right now. And this has happened at the same time that China's investment in the Caribbean has also increased dramatically, funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into the Caribbean in terms of investment, soft loans, and grants. So this South-South trade, I think, does challenge some of the, and the cooperation, that comes with it, challenges some of the conventional notions of what's involved with free trade agreements and with aid. There's little or no formal conditions that are tied to this kind of money, from whether it's China or Venezuela through ALBA. There are, of course, all kinds of informal concessions. So geopolitics is alive and well with all these concessions, whether it's a country having to recognize China's one country policy when they get money from China. With ALBA, we can talk a bit about that. But at its best, there are some innovative new forms of international cooperation that are emerging through ALBA. Some of these include things like in-kind payments and assistance to help vulnerable economies to avoid or dampen their unequal trade relations. So as one example, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where I was a few years back, Venezuela and Cuba have provided millions of dollars of in-kind assistance to the island to construct their first international airport. So in-kind assistance means that what they provided was engineering services, heavy machinery, wind stations, an on-site laboratory. They provided either use of this equipment or the equipment itself to the tune of, approximately $112 million worth of in-kind assistance. And so the idea is that St. Vincent doesn't have an international airport, and with the decline of the banana industry, they're hoping this will help them diversify with tourism, trade, and services, may or may not. So of $840 million that went into that airport, $112 million of it was in-kind from Venezuela and Cuba. So what have people been saying about these sorts of projects? There's so many different kinds of ALBA projects going on, I can't talk about them. In the short and medium term, the main focus has been on things such as ALBA as their lifeline aspects. So with the preferential agreements with banana and sugar on the decline. The EU increasingly less interested in the Caribbean, in fact, wanting to sort of separate themselves from the Caribbean so they can focus on their trade relations with Asia and larger Latin American countries. This has emerged as a lifeline for a lot of small islands in the Caribbean. It tends to place cooperation ahead of direct competition between states. There's a strategic diplomacy to it, which is building and strengthening South-South alliances. There's an emphasis on social regulation and social efficiency behind the kinds of projects they support, which I think is supporting a growing tradition in parts of Latin America and the Caribbean towards this. But I argue in my paper that there are longer-term benefits towards the lifeline aspects. A lot of people will acknowledge lifelines, but they'll say, yes, these Caribbean islands are desperate, so ALBA's giving them a lifeline, but there's nothing really developmental to it. They're just throwing money at them. And I think on the one hand, there's something true to that. Look, ALBA and other forms of South-South cooperation is not going to radically alter the geopolitical situation of small states in the Caribbean. They remain highly vulnerable, but resilient, as the discourse on the topic goes nowadays. Southern powers are increasing their influence, and of course, the rise of the South brings new competitors, major new competitors that dominate major global industries that make it that continue to erode the prospects of small Caribbean islands finding their niche, let's say. But at the same time, I think there are two aspects that have longer-term significance that if they continue to expand, and this is only in the case of the Caribbean that I've seen. The first is that the rise of South-South cooperation in ALBA is, I think, opening up greater policy space in the Caribbean to pursue endogenous development, to pursue a wider range of policy options than they would otherwise have on the table, not just for trade, but also for their domestic social policy and their foreign affairs more generally. So, for example, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they've done a lot of robust spending on healthcare and things and education, that especially education that wouldn't that maybe initially are frowned upon by organizations like the IMF and the World Bank in terms of how they raise funds for that. So this isn't something smooth. It's just that by having greater competition for the diplomatic access to Caribbean states and money coming to them that has less of the conditionalities associated typically with free trade agreements, there's more policy space. And I think the second thing that I find almost more interesting is that the rise of the South, I think, is bringing with it growing recognition amongst politicians, policymakers, and in some cases economic elites, over to the inevitable existence of statecraft that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, and the benefits that a state can accrue by employing it more directly and more consciously for policy ends. Because having additional policy space doesn't mean much if you don't have states that are willing to use that policy space. And I think that the rise of the South is bringing new symbolic and ideological challenges to the free trade package, and they're proposing new visions, innovative new visions for conducting international trade and cooperation. Now, I'd be the first to admit that these are subtle at times, but I think they're also far from insignificant. Two things in particular come to mind that are emerging from ALBA in the Caribbean. One of them is using statecraft to directly mitigate market volatility. And in this sense, ALBA is a world leader right now in bringing these concepts back onto the agenda, whether it's the in-kind assistance example I mentioned, whether they're promoting attempts to build direct exchanges, or exchanges that don't use American currency, whether it's preferential oil agreements for smaller partners that otherwise would have to pay more for their oil. And I think the second thing it's doing is that it's bringing back the notion of consciously using your statecraft to construct comparative advantage, which makes me think a lot of what Manfred was talking about with dynamic comparative advantage versus the neoclassical understanding of comparative advantage, which is that you let the market develop your comparative advantage. This involves the construction of economic and social infrastructure, consciously trying to carry out technology transfer. Now, on one hand, it involves buying into global market integration further when you talk about comparative advantage. But the way that comparative advantage is being pursued now through these mechanisms, I think does challenge some of the core premises of free trade and its ideological assumptions that comparative advantage will just merge out of unhindered market signals as opposed to something that needs guidance and direction from the state. So basically, in the end of the paper, I argue that the rise of the South and new forms of South-South cooperation do not eliminate a historically uneven and unjust situation of smaller states and vulnerable states in the Caribbean, but they are opening up new avenues and new political and economic tools that are going to be available and are available to Caribbean policymakers that were not on the agenda 10 years ago. South-South cooperation in the Caribbean appears to offer important gains for smaller states in the context of a highly imperfect and uneven real-world trading system.